With the help of Hashem, we are learning Moed Katan Daf Yud Gimel. We left off on Yud Beis, Amid Beis, by the Mishnah towards the end of the Amid. God willing, today we will conclude the second chapter of Moed Katan. Firstly, the Mishnah will speak about the concept of Lo Yechavin Es Malachtoi B'Moed, which means a person should not schedule one's work for Chol Hamoed. Even work that is allowed to be done, if you schedule the dafka to be done on Chol Hamoed, then not only may you not do so, but if you indeed did the work and it gave some result, whether the work itself, whether the salary that you got paid, there is a rabbinic penalty that you may not benefit from that gain. And the Gemara, going the bottom of the Amid, all the way until the next Mishnah, Daf Yud Gimel, is going to discuss the following. There are many times where we have a rabbinic penalty. Question is the rabbinic penalty levied only against the principal, against the person, the violator? And if after the violation, the violator passes away, are the children allowed now to derive benefit from that gain? Or is that penalty levied even against the children? In other words, Ke'ilu, is it something against the Gavra? The Gavra is not there. Or is it against the Chefza, against the money? Doesn't matter who's in the possession of the money. We're going to have, on Daf Yud Gimel, many details regarding engaging in business on Chol Hamoed. And like we mentioned, there are times that the issue is chashash, and there are times that we resolve the chashash. People should not think that it's all normal, it's business as usual. It's not, it's Yom Tiv, by allowing certain things b'tzina. And to really appreciate how we don't find the consistency in halacha. Indeed, that was the very interesting expression that we had yesterday on Daf Yud Beis, that hilchos moyed ki hilchos kutim, right? That ein lemeidos zumizu, right? Like a woman who's an akara. Sometimes we say if something is asa mishum maras ayin, we learned afilu b'chadrei chadarim is asa. We don't necessarily say that by Chol Hamoed. And then we'll see, many activities cannot be done in public. As long as it is done in private, you're good to go. We're going to review that which we learned in Psachim, that aside of the Isur Midrabanan, to do Malacha, Erev Pesach, after Chatzos, doing work, however it's defined in that context, Erev Pesach, from the morning until Chatzos, is totally b'minig. And if you live in a place where the minig is to work, you are allowed to work. And now we're going to learn the exceptions, that even if you live in a place where the minig is not to work, there are certain activities that are mamish for the moed, that everywhere, even in those places, you are allowed to work. We're going to learn about transporting, schlepping items through the Reshus Harabim. Okay, no, we're not addressing the Isur Choytza'a, because even if Chol Hamoed is taka like Yontiv, by Yontiv, as we learned in Beitza, mitoich shehutra l'tzoyrech, chutra shaloi l'tzoyrech. I mean, there are some restrictions, but the problem is not carrying per se, but it's this mundane activity of schlepping through the streets, that things could be schlepped only in private, and many, many details on this line. And Chevra, Freila Cheheit, let's start again, Daf Yud Beis, Amid Beis by the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Machnis Adam Peirosav Mepnei Haganov. A person is allowed to gather his produce from the fields, bringing them into the house, when there is a fear that leaving that product out there will be lost, will be stolen by thieves. Now, what is Bechlal the issue of gathering? So even though, if those of us who remember in Hilchos Shabbos, Ma'amed is a prohibition that is very limited. Ein ma'amed ela b'makom geduloi. If you remember, there's no ma'amed and again ma'amed. There are certain circumstances where if fruits are mamish at the location which they grew and they were never gathered before, the first gathering is one of the lamates malachas. That's not what the Mishnah is speaking about over here, as it will become clear. We're speaking about there is no imur issue. So what will be the problem? If there's no problem of gathering, like I just want to give you guys a good example. The kid said, in your kitchen, if your oranges are in a bowl and they spill, there's absolutely no issue gathering them and putting them back into the bowl. We're not speaking about the ma'amed. We're speaking about tircha. So tircha is superseded if there's a fear of money loss. That's the davar ha'avet. Another example. Right? They used to soak flax part of the process of making it into proper fibers and removing it from these vats in which they were soaking or redding, however it's called, is allowed to be done. Again, not to have a loss. However, here we go. Now, this line doesn't only go to these two examples, but this goes to all of the permitted activities for Chol HaMoed. If you had an opportunity to do this prior to Yom Tov and you said, you know what? Anyways, Chol HaMoed, my job is outlawed. What I normally do, I will not be allowed to do. I'll have so much free time. And in my house, they're going to tell me, where are we going, Chol HaMoed? Where are we going, Chol HaMoed? Perfect. I'll say, I would love to go. I have to do this. Don't do that, B'chlal. But if you designate your work for Chol HaMoed, so there's a penalty. Wow. Yoivdu means, again, the Chachamim made a knas that the owner is forbidden to benefit. Okay, whatever the case is, whatever it is, a job that you got paid for, you can't benefit from the money. Or like in our case, you gathered the produce into your house. The gathered produce becomes us. It's a very heavy penalty. Okay, says Abraisa, regarding the first example in the Mishnah, that you are allowed to schlep your fruits, literally, bring them into the house. Ubulvad shayachnisam betzina. Here we begin. You got to do it privately. However, whatever that means. Every case is a case. You can argue many times privately means at night. We'll see in a moment that no, sometimes privately means by day. Whenever it will cause the least amount of commotion, because we don't want the observer to look and to say, aha, you can do this, you can do that. It's like a weekday. And again, just to point out that normally when it comes to Marasayan, the words here are chashash. But normally when we speak about Marasayan, I know there's a machlokes about it, but we paskin that anything that's usher to be done in public cannot even be done in the chamber within your chamber. It's not the case over here. Rav Yosef says in our story, he had these heavy, large beams, and for whatever reason, they were not allowed to be left outdoors. It was going to rain or ganavim, and this is on Chol HaMoed. So you know what he did? He brought them into his house during the day. So Amalei Abaye challenged Rabbi Yosef from the Brisa that we just quoted. Did we not just learn wouldn't Sina private imply don't schlep it during the day, schlep it during the night, less people will see. So Rabbi Yosef tells Abaye that in this scenario, the better option, greater privacy, is dafka during the day. Sina dahani yamamuhu. Why? Because even the Malayla boy Gavri Yisera, if I were to choose to bring it in at night, I would need to get more people to carry it. Makes sense when you can see, it takes away one pressure. When things get darker, even though they would bring torches, but that in itself would bring about a certain hesitancy in the transportation, which would have to be counterbalanced by getting more volunteers. So you need more people. And you have to have torches. So between the more people and the torches, you're creating a greater commotion. There's less commotion, or in the positive, there's more tzina during the day than during the night. This is such a great application and story. Like, how do you define privately? Every case is a case. Then the Mishnah says, "V'shoyla pishtonim in Mishnah," and other examples. So, if there was a person that violated this and he did dafke push off the work to Chol HaMoed, and he did the work, and now he got paid, or now he has the benefit. And now this person passed away. Right? He passed away after he performed the work. Question is, do we say that his heirs also will have to forfeit all of that benefit? Now, let's compare this to other cases where we know what the halach is. So, on the top, when it comes to the rule of tsaram oizen bebechar, if you nick the heir, EAR, of a bechar, firstborn animal from a domesticated flock, has to be gifted to the kohen. Kohen himself has to bring it as a carbon. When there is no Beis HaMikdash, or even when there is a Beis HaMikdash, if the animal becomes blemished, it then becomes property of the bechar. There is a positive commandment in the Torah where it says, Kol mum loy hiyaboy. Kol mum loy hiyaboy doesn't say don't make it blemished, but from that we learn that the kohen may not, nor anyone may not purposefully blemish it. that's a biblical isur. But if someone purposefully blemished it, midoiraisa, now it's blemished. Comes along the Chachamim and they said, if you blemish the Bechar Dukain, you can never benefit from it. Same over there. There we know that yes, Konsu Banav Achrov. Says the Gemara, you know why? I can argue that case should not set the precedent for our case. Because over there, the Isur, like we mentioned, of blemishing a Bechar is midoiraisa. It says Kol Mum Liyaboy. Mechaven Malachte B'Moed is not a doiraisa. So it's a lesser violation. So maybe the penalty will be a lesser penalty. Let's find another example. Let me give you another case. That if a person owns a Evet Kanani, and when you own an Evet Kanani, when they go to the mikvah, which they should, they are makabel, they go to the mikvah l'shem abdus, but they take upon themselves to keep many of the mitzvahs of the Torah. Midrabanan, therefore, you may not sell your Evet Kanani to a non-Jew, aside of the issue of la'olam b'hem tavodim. But you may not sell it because he's going to be in the estate of people that don't keep mitzvahs. So you will almost prevent him from keeping mitzvahs. That's a rabbinic prohibition, also with a rabbinic penalty. We learned in Gittin like it is a double penalty. Aleph, you are mechuyev to redeem him, and there's two gears. You have to pay 10 times what you got to pay 100 times. There's another penalty that if he escapes that owner, you must free him. You have to free him, but it doesn't help you to free him because he belongs to someone else. So we're focusing on the other. You're mechuyev to free him. That the din is that if the one who sold the Evet Kanani passed away, and then the Evet Kanani ran away from his new master. So they're also konsu banav achrav. And by the way, that's only a violation of a rabbinic. So perhaps this should be a great precedent for our case. Kivin malach d'mamoyed midrabanan. You see that you cancel the kids here also. It's not a good comparison because I will argue over there. There, even by rabbinic violations, there's different levels. That's a much worse level. There, every day the Evet Kanani belongs to his new master. If he doesn't escape, he can't do the mitzvahs. But over here, here it's not such a big. It's not as bad as, if we may say that, as selling your Evet Kanani to a non-Jew. So do we say
what's the knas the kid the children?
The owner, let's say if Reuven sold his Evet Kanani, aside of him being mechuyev to redeem him, aside of that, if the Evet Kanani ran away from that master, ran away from his new master, the original owner has to free him. There's some details by Evet Kanani. There's a monetary thing. In the times when people owned avadim, like even if they would free them, they would also have to write them a shtar shichur. It's like a couple, even though they decide to separate. So he becomes free, and the owner has to write a shtar shichur. Okay. So the kids have to do it, but over here, it's not as bad as a violation. Do we say only gavra kanes rabbanon? And the person who is mechaven melach, they passed away. Therefore, say the kids are allowed to derive benefit. No, it wasn't. The penalty is not on the person. The penalty is on the item, on the cheftza. So that was the question that Rabbi Yirmiyah asked of Rab Zera. So Amalei, so Rab Zera tells Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tin Nisua, I will resolve your inquiry from a Mishnah in Shavias. It says, Soda sheniskaptza b'Shvias, if a field was cleared from thorns on Shemitah. Now guys, we are looking for someone who's violating only a rabbinic violation. Clearing the field from thorns, even though we learned in the beginning of this Masechta that by Shvias there's only avos, there's no tuldas. Toisvis here, the fourth line from the top, the last white line above the Gemara says, just to simplify, that we're speaking about already detached thorns. Clearing detached thorns from a field on Shemitah is only a rabbinic violation. That's what we're looking for. Someone did that rabbinic violation. He's not penalized at all. And yes, Tizra l'motzoi shvis. He's allowed to make use of his field. Motzoi shvis doesn't mean Motzoi Shabbos. Motzoi shvis means the whole 8th year. We don't say, you did work on your field, the ganze 8th year, go to sleep. We don't say that. But, says the Mishnah, if he heavily fertilized the field on Shemitah, we learned this already in this Masechta, he did not violate an Isur D'Oraisa, it's Isur D'Rabbanan. Or Nedaira, what we learned yesterday, they would pen off an area on a field, move a lot of animals in there. Animals are animals. and they're gonna fertilize it. Then you move the pen. So if you did that type of violation, that's much worse than gathering detached thorns. Here there's a penalty, which is loy tizra lamatzoy shvis. Next year, can't use that field. Now, we have the tradition that if indeed that was done, hey tiva, right? You fertilized it, umeis, the son is allowed to benefit from that field. Alma, we see that if again that in this type of rabbinic violation, lididei konsurabanan, but librei loy konsurabanan. So hachinami. If a person was machaven malachtim amoyet, only lididei konsurabanan, librei loy konsurabanan. That's proof number one. Proof number two. Amar Abaye naktina. We have the following halacha that timei tehoiroisav vames. If Reuven purposefully was metame Shimon's tahar food. Now, just to know that truma that becomes tame, the person who did that violated making truma tame, even if it's not truma, even if it's chulin food, and there's no isur to make truma food tame. But you know what happens? Tame food cannot be eaten by people that want to eat on a higher standard. So you devalue the food. A simple rule: less people can buy something, the lower the price. The more customers, the higher the price. Now, if I'm metama your food that's tahar, I afflicted a damage. This is hilchos choshen mishpat, but it's called a hezek that's not noticeable or it's not discernible. And on a biblical level, I'm not chayiv to pay. On a biblical level, we say that chayiv b'dina shamayim or patr b'dina adam. Okay, but b'drabanan, they said pay up. People are going to do it the whole time. I don't care about dina shamayim. So there's a rabbinic. So the din over there is that if a person was timei teroisav ameis, he violated the drabanan, and the person who made the damage is chayiv to pay for the damages, and the person passes away, and they have an estate. The estate is not lien to that payment. Loy konsu b'noy achrav. And my tama, again, since it's a hezek she'en nikir, we say loy shmei hezek on a biblical level. So therefore, the whole issue of needing to pay is only midrabanan. Here also, l'didei konsu rabbanan, l'brei lekonsu rabbanan. Okay, so I want to share bekitzer the following. There is an halacha that if a person sells non-kosher meat, God forbid, and the customer didn't know, he bought it. Then he finds out, oh my God, I bought treifa meat. What is the din? The din is that the seller has to give the money back. Whether the meat is here or not, he has to give the money back. If the meat is treif midoiraisa. If the meat was treif midorabanan, then it depends. If the customer still has the meat, then he forces the money back by giving the meat back. But if he already ate it up, he didn't know, I thought it's kosher, he doesn't have the meat to give back, then the seller doesn't have to give the money. And the big question is why? What's the difference? So the Nesivas HaMishpat has an approach, which many people quote, because all Isurei, the Rabbanan, are only in Isur Gabra. In other words, if something is only not kosher on a rabbinic level, the food is kosher. I'm not allowed to eat it. Since the food itself is okay, and he already ate it, so he has to pay for it. He can't get his money back.
What's an example of treif midrabanan?
Example of treif, chicken and milk done together. Or tzemach, many times when there was this tragedy here in Los Angeles many years ago, that a store that had a good hashgacha, tragically the owner, fell into the temptation of money, and he was selling. You can't say what he was selling over here was a treif midoiraisa. I don't want to mention names. He was selling from a shlachtos that had a very low standard shchita. Lav dafka also doiraisa. It was like non-glad.
What about glad versus non-glad?
That's a great example. That's what I'm saying. Non-glad is
not treif.
That's exactly but if people have a standard that they don't have non-glad, that's exactly what we're talking about.
But would this halacha apply to somebody who has a glad standard and was sold non-glad?
Exactly. That the seller has to give the money back, but he can demand his merchandise back. And if the merchandise is not here, by the letter of the law, he can say, I want my merchandise back. I just want to say that we know that Alter Rebbe in Tanya Perik Ches, when he's speaking about the real ruchnistic meaning of muter and asur, asur means it's bound. Alter Rebbe writes explicitly in Tanya that even if something, non-kosher food, is asur only midrabanan, it's asura, It's bound in Shalosh Klippas HaTameis. That's Isser Chefzer. We know from Teiras Emes, from Hasidus, that even Isuri that Rabbanan affect the Chefzer. It doesn't contradict our sugya. But you see this question over here, we are saying that this Rabbanan didn't go on the money. They didn't make an Isur on the money. Here, they made a Knas, and the Knas only goes on the person. Knas is much different than an Isur de Rabbanan. Okay, Mishnah. Let's go. Ein loichim batem avadim ubehema. One may not purchase houses. Can you buy a house in Chol Hamoed? Guys, these are real halachas. Can you buy houses? Don't purchase houses. Don't purchase slaves. Don't purchase animals. This concludes a car. Only if you need it for Yom Tov. If there's a Yom Tov need, you are allowed to do it. You are allowed to do it. How great is that? Says Tosfos 1, 2, 3. The third Tosfos is, oh, this is so important. Perush Rav Rabbi Yosef. You see that? The second to last Tosfos in the Amud. That even though the Mishnah gave examples of these big purchases, the Mishnah doesn't mean only these three. It means even these three. Any item, you're allowed to do. We're going to learn, God willing, today a limit on selling paytas, right? We're going to learn this on the base. And problems because when people buy fruit, they buy more than they need for the moed. We'll get to this in a moment. Why did they mention these three? He says we mentioned these three because these are items that are not sold in private. Just a fact. In other words, when a house is sold, it's not private. Even though people can make an effort here and they can make all these corporations to hide, it's a known thing. It's big products. That's even though this is normally done in public. If there's a moed need, you can purchase it. Or now here comes the key. This is the big key. Think about this, guys. You're the client. You don't need this house today. You don't need it today. You have a house already. You want to buy it. You don't need it. But the seller needs the money for Yom Tov. Beautiful. So the loikeach ayid, you give the guy dignity. He needs money. You can buy now. If you're going to use this heter, you can argue that almost anything is allowed to be done. We'll see this in a moment. This is a big heter that not the item, not that I need the item. The seller needs the money for Yom Tov. I can buy it, even though I don't need this now. Says the Gemara, something similar, right? Not by a sale. What about by service? If you have a laborer, right, and he's going to do for me a non Yom Tov tzorech. There's something that I need to pay someone to do or to fix something. I don't need that to be fixed today. But that worker needs the money for Yom Tov. I want to define something clearly. Needing the money for Yom Tov doesn't mean that without this, he'll starve to death. Very important. It's mamish what we learned yesterday. It means that person doesn't have in abundance money for Yom Tov. If there's no harchava, so by the selling a product, we're saying the moicher can sell it. The lekech doesn't need it. The lekech, if he has seichel, this guy needs the money for Yom Tov, buy it. You are allowed to buy it. What about service? Oh, so Amalei. So says Rav Nachman to Rava, Tanina. We learned it in our Mishnah. When the Mishnah says Oy l'tzoyrech hamoicher, and then the Mishnah concludes with the word she'ein loy mayoichal, and Oy l'tzoyrech hamoicher, according to the Havamina, already means that the moicher needs the money. So why did the Mishnah need to even write the word she'ein loy mayoichal l'cha'oira la'asuyei mai? It's coming to add not only in a case of a sale, also in a case of providing a service. That includes and everything basically can be done on that heter. If one party needs it, either the buyer needs it, right? The person to whom the service is being done needs that service, or the one providing the service needs the money for Yom Tov. Amalei, that's not a raya, because maybe the Mishnah Taka writes the word she'ein loy mayoichal is simply clarifying exactly what is it that the seller doesn't have. The seller doesn't have abundance of food, but when it comes to services, we don't know. Okay, so the question is open. Now, really, if the word is esvei, it's hard word to understand because this is like an answer. And normally, the word would be tashema. Now, we don't make up girsois, but let me esvei, this means here approve. Abaya, it says in a Mishnah, you're not allowed to write documents on moed. Writing is, again, a malacha. on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So you want to do it, you can't do it because write it afterwards. So there's a loan. Okay, write the document, but if the lender doesn't trust the borrower, you're not going to lend the money without getting a document. Now, how does that mean? We'll see that in a moment. Who does that go to? Who doesn't have what to eat? We're not speaking about the loan. You know what it means? It means that the scribe, you loan me money. You loan me money. You trust me. Even though normally we're going to learn in the Zikin that you should always get a document. I don't need the document, but the scribe needs the money. That's called a service. That's the meaning. So you can write it to give work for the scribe. What does it mean? Now, says the Gemara, it's not going on the borrower. We're not even addressing whether you can borrow the money. Indeed, shmamino. That we don't say it's only by a sale that we are allowed to take into account the seller's need. When it comes to providing a service, the job is not Yom Tov related. The recipient of the service doesn't need it. What's the Tzorech HaMoed? That the worker now will have MERCAVA money to buy food. MERCAVA, beautiful. Moisiv, Rav Sheishes, on this approach that you are allowed from a Mishnah Psachim. It says in the Mishnah, now we spoke this out in the introduction, that Koidem Kol, working from midday Pesach, Bizman Habayis. Even now, that's Asr. Working from Chatzois Erev Pesach onwards is Asr Midrabanan. When it comes to working for the first half of the day, totally b'minig. That was that whole sugya totally b'minig. Now, if you live in a place where the minig is not to work, nevertheless, even though the minig is not to work, but there are three types of works that always are allowed to happen. What are they? You'll see mamish tzorech moed. Hachayotim tailors. It's always, the button is, you got to fix this for Yom Tov. Hasaparim barbers. We don't take a haircut now because of Avelos, whether it is until Lag Bo'emet or our minig is until Erev Shavuos. Take a haircut. And v'hakoifsim and lawnderers. And the Mishnah explains, Hachayotim, what's the raya? Shekein head yotoifer kedarke b'choylo shomoyed. We're making a premise. Look at this comparison. Erev Pesach until midday is only a minig that you can't work. Cholamoyed, it's asur to work. So you can't have a case where Erev Pesach is more chamur than Cholamoyed. So since even on Cholamoyed, as long as it's not Maisa Uman, you can sow on Cholamoyed, and we're going to learn, God willing, in the beginning of next Pedic, next daf, that even though as a rule you may not take a haircut on Cholamoyed, as a rule you may not launder, but there are exceptions. There are times. Hasaparim, barbers, and Hakoifsim and launderers, if someone was unable to take a haircut prior to Yom Tov. For example, they came overseas, they were in the ship, there was no barber there, or they were in a ship, there was no laundromat in the ship. Or if a person left jail, we're going to go through all these cases. And there the din is muter l'saper l'chabes b'chaylo shalmayit. So therefore, listen to this premise. Anything that at times can be done on Cholamoyed should always be allowed to be done on Erev Pesach. Nekuda. Says the Gemara, if that's the logic, if you're telling me that even any service provider, if they need the money they can do it on Cholamoyed, and the premise is that if something is at times allowed to be done on Cholamoyed, it should always be allowed to be done out of Pesach, then everything should be allowed to be done out of Pesach. I know that by Cholamoyed there has to be a need. But since there are times that you can do any work when the work provider needs the money, then all work should be allowed to be done on Erev Pesach. Which is such a broad headed. And the question is based on the premise, not that which is allowed on Cholamoyed should be allowed on Erev Pesach. Shuki. It's that which is sometimes allowed on Cholamoyed should always be allowed on Erev Pesach. That is a stretch. That's the answer. So maskiv lot of papa. Maskiv means it's a question on the question. This is the answer really. Elama'ata, if based on your premise that which is sometimes allowed on Cholamoyed should always be allowed on Erev Pesach. So then if that's the case, you should be allowed to build on Erev Pesach. Why? Because there is one case where you can build. When can you build? We learned this already. If there is a wall leaning over the Rishus Harabim, there's a sakana. So then Elamata binyan lishtiri shekain koisel hagoya, a wall that's leaning over to the shusarabim. We learned you can knock it down and you can build it kedakim epnei asakana. That's proof number one. So we don't make the comparison at kedei kach. You understand? Number two, mask ravina elamata lavlot, a scribe. A scribe should always be allowed to write a night of Pesach. Why? Because on Chol HaMoed, if a man is being, we learned that you cannot do the nesuyin on Chol HaMoed. We learned that in the Mishnah. 4 reasons. Let's go. Ein ma'arav and simcha b'simcha. Everyone knows that reason. Fine. But what about kedushin? Kedushin you can do on Chol HaMoed. Because when it comes to kedushin, there's always the pressure that if you're not going to begin the connection, someone else will. You're going to lose her. Tosfos says, we learn in Soita that Arboim Yoim Koidem, that's announced who's marrying who. It can be changed. Okay, so very good. I love these one-liners. So now you can write it if the kedushin is happening, and if you're today we affect kedushin by giving a ring. One of the 3 ways you can affect kedushin is by writing a document, right? Shekain koisvin kedushin nashim, or God forbid, if there's a get is allowed to be written on Chol HaMoed. Number 3, if a person has money to pay back, and the lender knows if I don't get payment now, I don't know if I'll get payment again. I need to get payment now. But the guy who wants to pay back the money says, I'll pay you the money back. I want a receipt. So these are scenarios where you can write. So if we're going to use this logic that anything that is at times allowed on Chol HaMoed should always be allowed on Erev Pesach, so then you should be allowed to build, you should be allowed to write. Elo, therefore, Amar Avashi. Here's the rule. Moed Arba Asar Koramis, you're comparing or contradicting Chol HaMoed to Erev Pesach. Moed, the issue of working on Chol HaMoed is always connected to Tircha. Anything that has a level of exertion, especially if it's not needed for Yom Tiv, that is what we prohibit. And therefore, on the other hand, there comes a point, even though there's a Tircha, but if there is a loss, at times there is Sharu Rabbanan. Let's call it this. Tircha Shaloi L'Tzoyrech. If there's a money loss, you got yourself your tzorech. It's a tircha l'tzorech. But Arba Asar, the whole reason why the minig was not to work out of Pesach was not because you're not allowed to do tircha. It's about we want for you to have more time free. You can't do this, you can't do that. You'll be more engaged in getting ready for Yom Tov. Arba Asar mishum tzorech Yom Tov. So therefore, what should be allowed to be done? Only that's tzorech Yom Tov. You understand? Like going to a tailor, even these works. Tailor is tzorech Yom Tov. Haircut is tzorech Yom Tov. Laundering is tzorech Yom Tov. But anything that's not tzorech Yom Tov will be lo yisharu rabbanon. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. Now we're speaking pashut about schlepping. Again, tircha. Ein mefanen mibayis labayis. A person is moving. Now there are 2 issues here. Issue number 1 is that it's called tircha yisera. Whoever made a move, even with the company. Tircha. Number 2, this is important. There's a concept of uvda d'choil. It's very mundane. However, it's not written over here. The Gemara in Yerushalmi says that if a person is moving into their own home from a rental on Chol HaMoed, they are allowed to move, because the joy of moving into your house is such it won't be a tircha. How do you define tircha? This is so subtle.
What about Ben Ma'av Simcha B'Simcha?
Oh, so Yakir is asking, such a great simcha. I like your question. Interesting. But let's go back. These words will be clarified, but you can move. Mefana means to clear out. Clear means to clear out from place A and move it into place B to your chatzar. Now, what does it mean to your chatzar? The Gemara is going to clarify. If I, prior to Yom Tiv, gave an article to a uman. Uman means to a craftsman. I'll give you an example. I gave my suit to a dry cleaner. I don't need that suit for Yom Tov, but it's ready. Any article that's finished by the pro, I need to pick it up. So there's 2 dinim. If I need it for Yom Tov, there's no problem. What happens if I don't need it for Yom Tov? There's one other potential issue. What's the other potential issue? I don't feel that it's that safe over there. But if there is no need for Yom Tov and there's no potential loss, there's no ganovim there, so that's what the Mishnah says. But choishish means you are afraid it's going to be stolen. So just in other words, if the fear is going to be stolen from the house of the uman, yakir logic, you can remove it from the house of the uman, but it doesn't mean you can bring it into your house. In the case, for example, that you have a chaver near the uman, not your house. and from his house there's no chashash, then you are only justified to schlep it from the uman's house to that house. Mefane l'chotzer acheres, to the closest chotzer where you trust it won't get stolen. And what's the issue of schlepping? So there's a tircha, and even though we're not speaking about moving a home, we're moving a keli is not tircha. There's a tircha and the uvda de chol. Starting to schlepping, we all know. What do you have? A schlepper? Schlepping is like a mundane activity. Now, the line avul mefanu l'chatzedi has to be clarified. How can you move it to your chatzed? The Reisha says ein mefanu l'bayis l'bayis. I mean, the havamina is that if I'm moving from rental to rental, but my new rental is a house adjacent to a chutzner that I own, but I don't own the house. That was the havamina. So what? You're not allowed to do that. I'm going to buy it. No. Seifa ason l'bayis shebechutzner. What it means is it's from rental to rental. From rental to rental, but if both houses are in the same complex, which means that you're not schlepping your items through the Reshus Harabim, you are only going through the Chatzar. Two things. First of all, it's a little bit less of a tircha. It's not that much less. Whoever moved knows. Once you packle everything up, it doesn't make a difference whether you're moving to next door or whether you're moving to the other end of the world. But the ikid is it's not done in public. That's when it's allowed. So Amar Rav Papa says that when we were Talmidim by Rava, it's typical in Yiddish, it's called a faher. That Rava Badaklan, he asked us the following question. He wanted to see if we know the answer. He said, he contrasted. In our Mishnah, it says, problem is, let's go back to Erev Pesach, Mishnah Psachim. Oh, guys, I take back to Erev Pesach. That's the answer. The Mishnah Psachim says, Moelichin means you can bring, right? Meviyim means you can take back kalim from a house of a uman, again, a craftsman, anything, a table broke to the carpenter, whatever it is. It doesn't that mamash contradict our Mishnah? So that's what Rava asked us, and we right away Talmidim answered, Kan, meaning the Mishnah Psachim is speaking about the 14th. There is where the Mishnah says that even though it's not L'tzoyda Chamoyed, guys, don't forget, it's only out of Pesach. Kan, meaning Mesechtas Moed Katan, is Choyle Shel Moed. This answer is the good answer that will remain. The next answer is going to be refuted. But Iboy say, they also wanted to say that both Mishnah Yasin is speaking about Chol HaMoed. Difference is, Kan, our Mishnah in Moed Katan is speaking about where you trust the craftsman, which is why the Mishnah says you're not allowed. Remember, guys, these are the two things. Tzoyda Chamoyed, you're allowed to take it. Even not Tzoyda Chamoyed, our Mishnah is you trust him. The Kan, meaning the Mishnah Psachim, is B'She'enam Aminoi. You know why it doesn't work? Because the Mishnah Psachim didn't only speak about taking it back, it also spoke about bringing it. That's going to be the refutation of that. But before we get to that, you give Amid base. Oh, we got to move. Hatanya, 1 second. Hatanya means Araya. And they proved the Siboy Yisema. Says in Abraisa Mediyam Kalim, Mibeisa Uman, you are allowed to bring back your stuff from the house of an Uman on Cholamoyed, for example, Kad Mebeisa Kador. You have a picture from the potter's house, because these are things that you use on Yom Tov, normal. Kois, a cup, a glass cup, Mibeis Hazagog, from the glass makers. And these are items that you typically use on Yom Tov. You use a jug, you use a cup. But if you have wool and you gave it into a dyer's plant, D-Y-E-R, and you want to bring it back, you're not going to, it's an unfinished product. You still have to make it into a baguette. You're not going to use it for Yom Tov. You can't do that. Nor kalim that you don't need, kalim from a craftsman's house, but means the craftsman doesn't have what to eat. So the guy says, it's like today, when do you pay the dry cleaners? When you pick it up. You're not mechuyev to pick it up today. But if you know that he doesn't have what to eat, so don't think, says the Braisa, you can pick it up. You know what it means? You know what you should do? Pay him and pick it up later. But then again, you can't even take it home. It's not that you can take it home. If you are afraid that it will be stolen from the base of Uman, so then you are allowed to walk it, to schlep it to the closest safe area. Now, you're chayish the neighbor. Certain people suspect everyone. You have no other, we'll skip the parentheses. If the only trustworthy home in the whole city is your home, you're living in Sodom, and then you can bring it home. Then okay, all of that.
Say that then you don't have the obligation to make sure that he has food. You still have to make sure that he gets paid.
Correct, that's for sure. But if you're chayish that it's going to be stolen, even if the craftsman doesn't need the money, you can take it home. But the moment you're taking it home, normally he'll demand payment right away. That's his collateral. Bottom line is that we have such a difference. The Gemara says that doesn't answer. The Iboy Sema doesn't work because that only explains the Mevian. But Moilichin Kasha. In other words, in our Mishnah it says a Mevian. Our Mishnah is speaking about taking it back home, which means for sure you cannot bring it too. There it says you can bring it too. Right? If the Mishnah in Pesachim is speaking about Chol HaMoed, you got a contradiction, and therefore Mechaber to the correct answer, the white answer is the first answer. The Mishnah in Pesachim is not speaking about Chol HaMoed; it's only speaking about Erev Pesach. Next Mishnah, again Tircha that is allowed. Mechaper es haketziois bekash. If you have figs and they're out there drying, and you don't want for them to get wet, and they used to use straw to cover them over, that's a tircha. That is allowed to be done because if you won't properly cover it, the figs won't be as good as they could have been. Rabbi Yehuda adds, Afma Abin. You can even make it thick. We'll see soon what Rabbi Yehuda is adding. Next, Moichrei Pedus, people that sell produce, or they sell garments, or Vikalim, they sell utensils. That was the chiddush of the last Mishnah. The items we spoke about in the last Mishnah by default is a befaresia. Here it could be sold. Bitsina, moichinin bitsina, let's say the chamayt. So two dinim. Number one, you can sell it if there's a need. We already learned both ways. Say if you need the food, say if the seller needs the money from the profit, but it has to be done in private. Next case, hatzayodim, trappers, people would pound grain into grits. Today we buy everything in a box, but grain, the many grains were not made into flour, into bread. They were made into what we would call a hot cereal. So they would be pounded, they would be split. That was an avoid the nachal, was a little bit noisy. That may be done. Mahagoroisos, people that grind beans. All these works are allowed to be done. Bitsina, litzoidech, hamoyed. Now there's a big chiddush. The big chiddush here is that normally this is an avodah that's not done just for tzorech hamoyed. This is an avodah that's done in larger amounts. But if you need it for the moyed, then you can do it. Now we learned yesterday you can't overdo it, but you can make enough b'harchava for Yom Tov. Rabbi Yosi Oimer, they were machmar on themselves. We'll see what he means. End of the last Mishnah in Perek Sheni. Now let's learn the Gemara. First of all, regarding the machloikas between the Tanach and Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says you can even be ma'abin? So there's a machloikas between Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Yosi. Both of them are sharing a machloikas of earlier Amoyroyim, Chizkiya and Rabbi Yechanan. Chad Omar, that when the Tanakama says mechapin, it means you're taking straw. You can cover the figs, but you can't do it properly. You have to do akalushe. You can only put a very thin layer of straw over it. And the straws are not gepakt. In other words, you minimize the tircha. And on that comes Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, no, af ma'abin. You can use asamuche, a lot of straw, thick straw. That's one way of understanding. Chadoma, no. Bechapin, even the Tanakama doesn't limit how much straw you can use. Bein haklushe, bein asmuche. The meaning of Rabbi Yehuda of ma'abin is not about the straw. It means that that you can gather the figs together to make the figs easier to cover. You can put the figs into a pile. All of these activities are uvda the chayil. Doesn't matter. It's once we allow for this to be done because there's going to be a loss to the figs if they're not properly covered, you can even pile them in a pile. That's what he means. And Tanya Nami Hachi, Ma'abin means oisen kimin kri, divided Rabbi Yehuda. So it's a double-headed because once we know what Rabbi Yehuda means, now we also, not only is Rabbi Yehuda the lenient here, you can even make it into a kri, even though the Tanakama doesn't allow for you to manipulate the figs, but even the Tanakama allows for you to put any amount of straw that you feel is needed to properly cover the figs. Next, Moichrei Pedus, people who sell produce, people that sell garments, people that sell any kalim, if they are needed for the moyed, they can sell it bitsina, and Rabbi Yosi says, "Heim hechmiru al atzman." Was meant Rabbi Yosi? Elyahu, heim hechmiru al atzman. It can mean menakotz el akotz. Who's machman? Who's mekel? Option number one is it means that they opted not to do this at all. Doloi avdu klal. Option number two is not only is Rabbi Yosi not more machmir, Rabbi Yosi is more lenient. Rabbi Yossi holds that just like selling a home is done by faresya, because that's just the nature of the sale, Rabbi Yossi holds that me'ikir adin, anything that's needed for the moed could be sold in public. The concept of bitzina is not me'ikir adin, it's only a chumrah. Or the Tanach holds you are mechuyev to sell it to bitzina. Rabbi Yossi says, okay, the minig is, it's a chumrah they took upon themselves, but you don't have to sell it bitzina. He's either very machman or very mekel. So what is his opinion? So Tashmat says in a brayso, moichle peiros or ksus or kalim, moichlin bitzina l'tzoyre chamoid. These are the words of the Chachamim, the Tanach of our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer, here it's clear. Tagore Tiveria, the merchants of Tiberias, hey, achmiru al atzman, shelo yiu moichlin koliker. Clear. You see, he's more machman. And it's not an obligation. You're not bound by it, but he wants for you to know that there are people who decided, when you live in Tiveria, you know that you better buy all of these peiros before Yom Tov, because you're not going to find anything opened during Chol HaMoed. Next, Sodi Chayis Oifes, trappers of Chayis and Oifes V'dogim, Sodin B'tzina L'Tzoyre Chamoed. On Chol HaMoed, they can go trap as long as they do it in the most private way possible. And again, Rabbi Yossi let us know that the trappers of the city of Akoi, hey, mechmiru al atzman, again, means shelo yu tzadam kolik. We clearly see what Rabbi Yossi means. Next, another example related to our Mishnah. The shoishe. The shoishe, again, is this manufacturing of hot cereal. So they would take grains and they would split them. They used a hammer. They used an instrument that would open it up. And now when you cook it in hot water, works. So there are three types of grains that become split open. One is called chilka. We'll see exactly. Chilka means it's one approach. It's only split into two. One grain, you gave it one kanak. Tarigis, it's split into more parts. Tisnei, it's split into even more parts. Like how fine is that oatmeal? So the Tanach holds again that you are allowed to do that work on Chol HaMoed. Doishushin but betzina, if there is a moed need, and Rabbi Yossi Omer that the doshoshim of tzipoire hey machmiru al atzman shelo yu doshoshim kol iker. Now that we mentioned all these three types of grains that are pounded into different shtikalach, so Abaye says chilkam then it refers to chada letarte. You have a grain, and it's about the tool that you're using. It's about the power that you are investing when you're pounding it. It only breaks it into two. It already makes it more edible. Targis refers when you had one that became into three, you split it into three verses, and tisnei is chada la'arba. No, it's different levels of the same concept. However, ki asa Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came to Babel, he said, no, he says that chilka is not pounding grain. Chilka is referring to spelt. Kunta means spelt. So the Gemara says, hold on, it doesn't fit. Meisvei, how can you, Rav Dimi, say that the chilka, when you learn chilkin by the Tanoim, it means some sort of spelt, something that's made from spelt, doesn't fit. Doesn't fit. Because it says in the Mishnah, chilka and targis and tisnei, temeyim b'chol makoim. What's the intro to this Mishnah? We know that food can only become tamei, even if it has contact with the source of tuma. If prior to the halachic contact, it became susceptible to becoming tamei, it needed to become muchsher lekabel tuma. How does anything that is food become muchsher lekabel tuma? If it's something that comes from the ground, if it's something that grows after it was harvested, then it became wet. It became wet, at least with the knowledge and contentment of the owner. And now it's dry. Since it became wet, now it's muksher. Great example will be grain. Of course, when the grain is connected to the ground, it rains. After you harvest grain, did the grain become wet prior to you making it into flour? So it depends. If it's made for villagers that were not that refined, and therefore they didn't need for their flour to be that pure, they didn't soak it in water prior to the next steps, prior to grinding it into flour. So therefore, the Mishnah says that if you buy flour in a village, even if there is a source of tumah that touches your flour, it remains pure, because who says it never got wet? Flour that's brought in the cities, people that are fenced, they're fancier, the steps to making it also included at some point soaking the grain into water, and then you have to be chayish that it became wet, and if there's a source that touches it, so says the Mishnah that these three items, chilka, targis, and tisnei, no matter where it became wet. Now, guys, the process of doishashe, when you would take the grain and pound it and split it, to do that properly, you needed to soak it into water for this process to work. So if chilka is basically like targis and tisnei, that's the same thing, then it makes sense. Now, or 1 into 3, or 1 into 4, because we know the iskashur, it became mukshar, because making grain into what they called then hot cereal, oatmeal, demanded for it to be soaked. But according to you, Rafdimi, you're telling me that chilka means kunta, spelled. Why is it tami mechol makayim? Again, did they soak spelt? Why would spelt be different than other grains? It should also depend if you are the villager or was it made for the cities. Haloi is kasher. You don't know for sure, but you don't have to soak the whole grain of spelt. So the Gemara says now, even according to Rav Dimi, kunta refers to spelt whose outer shell was removed. That's the meaning of chulka. Chulka means it's smooth. And the only way to properly remove the outer klipa is by soaking it. That's not a kasha. Kigoin the miklafan, because the lav the sharu lubamaya, if you don't soak it in water, lo have a miklafa, you would be unable to take out the outer peel. And indeed, why, even according to Rav Dimi's interpretation, why is spelt that's peeled called chulka? Because the shkal, because you removed from each kernel the outer husk, and therefore chilakihu, you made it smooth. Okay, he was not yet refuted. Next, Mitzvah, again, a kasha on Rav Dimi says in a braisa, if a person made a vow to abstain from having dagan, so the din is, now guys, halachically, who knows what's called dagan? Halachically, dagan, especially where only means the 5 grains. Halachically, right? Wheat, barley, spelt oats, and rye. When it comes to vows, there's a rule. Halech achar lashon b'nei adam. Common sense. When you made a vow, it's about not how the Torah uses the word that you used in your vow. It's about what people mean when they say that word. Literally, dagan means a pile. And many products that are gathered, we call them legumes, even though they're kitnias. But the way you would harvest it off the field would be such that they would undergo a stage where they are piled in a dagan, in a kri. So when a person makes a vow, all of the dagan in the world is asur to me, you don't say this guy may only not eat the 5 grains. No, he's asur even from pul hamitzri yavish. This dry Egyptian bean also underwent digun, which means balashon b'nei adam, a pile. Now, however, even that moist pul hamitzri did not undergo this piling step, and therefore he's still allowed to have the lach. He's allowed to have rice. Rice does not undergo a digun. No, it's not only is rice not dagan. Halachically, rice, even b'lashon b'nei adam, is never put into a pile. He's allowed b'chilka v'targes v'tisnei. Now the problem is like this: even though, guys, oatmeal is coming from the 5 grains, so why would you be allowed to eat it? The answer is, when it was the way it was in the pile, that is what you may not eat. But now that you changed it by pounding it, it's considered a new product. From that, you never made a vow. No shaper enough. However, if according to Rav Dimi, chilka means kunta, so then dagan ma'alyahu. Kunta is spelt. And even though you took out the husk, that doesn't change it. So that's a kasha. I mean, you can answer, no, you changed it, you took it out of the outer husk, but that's a kasha. Furthermore, let's go weiter Rafuna. In other words, therefore, we prefer to interpret chilka meaning a certain type of grain that was pounded minimally. He allowed certain spice merchants to sell their product in public. No tzina needed. How can you allow these spice merchants to sell spices on Chol HaMoed? without telling them do it privately. We learned in a Braisa regarding stores in general. Can you properly open your store on Chol Hamoed? The Braisa says not. Even when there's a heter, like we learned in the beginning of today's daf, even if the item is not needed, the storekeeper doesn't have money b'harchava to buy for Yom Tov. He's opening up a store. He's going to work. Do it as a shinui. What would a shinui mean? So you should know that the way the stores were established in the times of Chazal is that cities had what we call today a main street, but it was really a big opened area, and stores opened up towards it. But they also had, for the customers, rows of benches out there in the public. Now, certain doors of the stores opened up straight to the big square. They had better visibility, higher rental, and certain stores were behind these benches. Now, if a store, now it's advantageous to have such a store because there is a restriction. B'chlal, don't open up a store the way stores are normally open. So the Braisa says, "Chanois psucha l'stav." If the door of your store opens up to this bench area, so there's a bench that's blocking the opening of the store to a certain degree. People see, you understand, it's open, but it's not mamish opened. Then Pesach v'nayil kedarki. Then on Chol Hamoed, whenever you're allowed to do business for whatever heter, there's no issue of how should you open your doors. But if psucha l'reshus harabim, then poiches, poiseach, achas v'nayil achas. Like if it's a double door, only open one. And with one exception, that the Erev Yom Tov Ha'achron Shel Chag, Erev Shmini Atzeres, Machlokes Rishonim, whether the same as Erev Shvi Shel Pesach. But at the end of Yom Tov, since everyone is buying, you ate up all the food that you prepared from before. Now you got to restock. So here, there's no restriction. Moitzi, not only can you open up both doors, but you can even bring your produce out there. Bottom line is, says the Gemara now, meaning there is this concept that even when you are allowed to sell what you're selling, because there is a tzorech hamoyed, do it when you could at least bitzina. Why did he say, you guys sell spices? Sell it in public. Answers the Gemara like Hashem. When do we have restrictions? This is Gavaldik. When is there an importance to sell it bitzino? When the item that you are selling is a item that will last for more than Yom Tov. Even though I'm only buying it for Yom Tov, when I observe you buying oranges, the oranges that you're buying, if you won't eat it this week, it will be good next week. Items that have a longer shelf life, it's not clear that it's tzorech hamoyed. So we make another restriction: sell it more in private, or open the store in a way that half of the store, only one door is open and not two. But when it comes to spices, they don't last. They become in Yiddish oisgewebt. Like that's why today when you buy pepper, you make it, because if it's already ground up, they didn't have the packaging that we have now. When you have spices, if it's not fresh, it's not going to do anything. It won't give a tam. So it has a short shelf life. Everyone knows whoever is buying it can only use it for a day or two or three. It's clear. And that's why there are no restrictions. And just Alpi Chasidus, just to know like this, that tam means inspiration. The tam, the lachluchi is, right, the 4 levels of letters. The highest one is the tam. Tam dikra. Tam doesn't last that long. Sheva Yipol Tzadik Vakam. Today you are inspired. Peiros are the mitzvahs that we do. Peiros lasts forever. No, that's a yid. There's certain things that it is what it is, and certain things are special, and it only comes at time. So the tam, since it only comes at time, it's clear it's Yom Tov related. There are no restrictions. How great is that? And Chevra, just to say that next Perek, which is the 3rd and final chapter, is even though we're going to begin with Chol Hamoed, this is the area in Shas that we speak about. Hilchas Havelos, the Rosh in Moed Katan wrote 100 simanim on our sugya, and that the Rosh on Moed Katan is the source for basically all of the laws of mourning. And Hashem should help again that learning this should make us be yoitza, and whoever needs a refuah shalema should have a refuah shalema, and all of us should live until Mashiach. Amen. To be continued.
Thank you, Rabbi.
That means not fresh, but there's a better translation. Shkoyach.